can help field some questions, get the discussion going. Antonio, start.
First of all, thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I have just one quick comment and a quick question. The comment is that I thought that you picked the right term, realism. I actually like it. So I don't know why you have some misgivings about it, because I think that it does intersect with what perhaps is the best aspect of some of these other traditions, in the sense of the avoidance to finding silver linings in the present and so on and so forth. And that leads to my real question, which is, part of your title has to do with utopia. So I wonder if you can stake out more explicitly how you see the intersection between realism and utopia, especially because many accounts of utopia, say Ernst Bloch or even more recently Fred Jameson, in many instances you find a wishful thinking built into that leads to redeem sometimes even the trashiest works of culture, in the case of Jameson, right? Or even Slavoj Žižek, who will try to redeem Heidegger as a revolutionary because he took the right step in the wrong direction, or arguments like that for me actually cut a lot of the sobriety, political sobriety that one will associate with the kind of realism that you are advancing. But at the same time, I think that you want to keep the imagining that goes along with utopia. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how realism intersects with utopia, especially to avoid the temptation of finding silver linings where there are none.
Yeah, I do wish I had a fixed line on that. I can just try to say what I can say about that. My thoughts about that are most influenced by the work of this German anarchist at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Gustav Landauer. As you know, he was a Jewish anarchist writer who was part of the Munich Soviet Socialist Republic at the end of the First World War, and was beaten to death by soldiers as part of the mop-up of that. As you know, the Social Democratic government called in the army to suppress these things, and Landauer was bludgeoned to death in the courtyard of one of the prisons. And he wrote a book in about 1901, I think, called Revolution, and he distinguishes there between topia and utopia. And he says, well, topia is whatever place it is that we inhabit at the moment, we describe it. And utopia refers to all the unsatisfied desires that we have in the present, all the desires that we have that can't find their satisfaction in the society that we know. And it seems to me that one of the ways of going about thinking about this is to think about the present as it were ex negativo. Think about the present and think about what it is in the present that we, what desires that we have that we don't see ourselves as capable of satisfying in the present. And what desires do we see other people having? What are all the, as it were, look around the world and find all the tendencies there that are tendencies that move in the direction of something which can't be accommodated by the world as it is. And you begin with that. And then, of course, I think it's really important that the life of the imagination has a kind of relative independence, that we can imagine things. It's very important that our imagination is not disconnected from action. That's important, because that just makes it pathological. It's very important that it's not disconnected from action. But it's also important that not everything you imagine you actually act on at the moment. I mean, and it's extremely important to get the relation between those two things right. I mean, there are the cases that I think of are cases of moral dilemmas where we might think we have to act, so that suppose there are two courses of action involved, and we know we can't actually do both of the things at the same time. And we reflect on that, and for whatever reason we decide we need to do one. I think it's important to see that it might be an important moral property of that situation that even though we decided to do one, we didn't, as it were, fail to have some kind of imaginative regret for not actually also being able to do the other. So it might well be the case that you agree, yes, we had to do that, but there's a cost for that. And so the way in which I try to, I don't have, as I said, I don't have an answer to that, but the way in which I try to approach that would be in that way, to think about topia, utopia, that which can't be satisfied in the present, and then ways in which it would be important for us to keep a cognitive and imaginative hold on that, even if it wasn't the case that we could see how at the moment we could act in such a way to realize it.
Thank you.
August.
I had planned to come without knowing the title of the talk, only because I just started reading recently your book on philosophy and real politics, and I was particularly struck by your reading of Lenin. And but when I saw the title, I realized I had to come because there's a real question I've been grappling with for some time. And while I agree with everything you said, I'm interested in how do you actually make this effective? How do you actually apply this? And the example I give is most of my friends and family voted for Obama. And I tried to argue otherwise. And at a certain moment, I realized that it was about wishful thinking. And
Wishful thinking on whose part?
Huh?
Wishful thinking on whose part?
On their part.
On their part, yes, right,
On
yes,
their part.
right, yes.
And I couldn't convince them otherwise.
Yes.
And so I guess, how can you help me to be more effective? What would be the
Yeah,
criteria?
yeah, I'm in a bad situation here. I mean, and I might as well just be honest about it. I mean, theoretically, I'm very much in favor of the idea that philosophy should be connected to politics, and it should attempt to think about ways of being effective, etc. I think theoretically that's very important. But actually, I'm completely hopeless at that kind of activity. And I just think that different people have different talents, and there are people who are very gifted at changing people's minds and at thinking. I'm just not. If I have any abilities, it's in these more sort of structural things. So all I can say is I don't think there's any. I in general don't think that in politics there are recipes or algorithms. You're not ever going to find someone who will tell you how, in all cases, you can get rid of wishful thinking. By the very nature of the beast, if the wish is strong enough, it's strong enough, and you know. So and then if you ask the question is, well, how do I cause someone, it's a sort of recipe for divorce. How do I cause someone else to have a different desire than the desire they have? And the answer to that is, it depends on what, you can't cause someone else to have a different wish from the wish they have. You can talk to them, you can change the environment, you can do all sorts of things, but you can't reach inside a person's brain and change it. And so all I can say is that the question about wishful thinking, I think, is more difficult than questions about changing people's desire structures in general, because the very fact that the person is engaged in wishful thinking means that the wish is very deeply rooted. If it wasn't really deeply rooted, it wouldn't have the power in general to overcome the rational capacities. But if it really is deeply rooted, then again, I'm tempted to say, I don't know about that. That's a problem with life. How do you change people's beliefs? And all I want to say there is, it's neither the case that we have a reliable mechanism for doing it, nor is it the case that we don't at all know how it might be done over the long run. I mean, we do know how, over the long run, you can change people's beliefs. I mean, for example, maybe your family will change their view about Obama in 2 years. Now, that might be true, but irrelevant, right? Because they've done it already, right? I mean, So I'm afraid I have no solution to that.
Nancy.
Sorry. I also wanted to thank you for a very provocative talk, and I wanted to push a little bit on the sort of the place for reason and desire both in the model of realism that you presented in the talk. And part of what I have in mind is a relatively recent book by Jonathan Lear entitled Happiness, Death, and the Remainder of Life, where he thinks about a very well-developed kind of wishful thinking, neurosis, as a particular way of structuring one's existence such that one's thoughts on one's actions and the consequences resulting from them are not easily or readily available to rational thought and reflection. And part of what he turns to Freud then to draw on is how is it that some kinds of wishful thinking sort of rely on a kind of affect and a kind of psychic structure that makes the wishfulness of one's thoughts particularly difficult to dislodge. It seems, for individuals then, the challenge is to think about, well, how then can we try and engage somebody's, both their desirous structure but also their rational structure, so as to change the way that they bring the two to bear on one another. And then in resituating that question in the context of politics, the problem would seem to be sort of doubly difficult, in that it's hard enough, to attempt such an endeavor with single individuals, but then to think in terms of political communities where you can't turn to something like, the structure of the mind in order to understand that play of reason and desire. It becomes even more tricky to understand, well, where is it that the investments in a particular kind of wishful thinking might come from, and how is it that they can be revisited and revised?
Well, that's a really complicated question, isn't it? That's a question about the difference between individual psychology and the collective case. And of course, in some respects, it might be easier to mobilize forces against wishful thinking in the collective case than it is in the individual case. That is, in the individual case, I might have all sorts of wishful thoughts to which you wouldn't have much access. I mean, how would you get access to them, really? On the other hand, if the newspapers constantly are writing, so-and-so is such a wonderful reflection on how wonderful we are, you can easily imagine that you could bring to bear on that facts that might be incompatible with that. Now, that's only a practical answer. It's not a theoretical answer. But I'm afraid I'm completely at sea at knowing how to give a theoretical answer to your question. But I think it is really important.
Okay. For Emily, I think you're next.
Thank you. You can regard the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence as an act of wishful thinking, in the same way as you can regard the Iraq War as an act of wishful thinking. Both of them were subject to empirical, experiential test, and suffered and had significant modifications made to them over the course of time. How does the concept of wishful thinking help you to make an analysis or distinction between those two, as opposed to just simply looking at the results of these policies, these ideas in the real world?
Okay, that's really good. There's another part of the sort of general line here that I didn't talk about, which is it's tremendously important, especially in the history of political thought, but also in the history of ethics, that when many central concepts are introduced, they're not introduced to reflect a pre-existing reality. They have a kind of proleptic character. They're construing the present in the image of a predicted possible future. The example that I think of always here is the example that my friend Quentin Skinner analyzes. When the concept of the state is introduced in early modern political thought, there aren't really things around that satisfy the conditions for being a state, right? A state is supposed to have these wonderful properties of being a completely independent locus of an authority that's accepted, and so it has this property. And in fact, it's described, it's introduced at a time in which that isn't the way the world works, actually, and it's before the Treaty of Westphalia, and so it's introduced as in an it's a radically anti-empiricist form of concept formation. You don't look out there and see what's out there and then you describe it. You create this idea. It would be a good thing if there were not overlapping constituencies in Europe, and the bishop of so-and-so couldn't interfere with that. It would be a good thing if we all had these states and they had these properties, and now I'm going to introduce this concept of state, and that's a kind of experimental project. We'll try to introduce it, and we'll see if it works. And some of these work, and some of them don't, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't work as well as the state. The Phalanstère doesn't work as well as the state. The Führerprinzip doesn't work as well as the state. So some of them succeed and some of them don't. Now, it seems to me, though, that there's a difference between accepting that and, I mean, is your question to me, would my analysis make that kind of project impossible? Or is your question to me, how do I distinguish between the conceptual innovations that will be successful and the ones that won't be successful? Because clearly, the second question, I have no answer to that. I mean, I don't know which ones will work and which ones won't work unless you tell me which one it is. As far as the first one is concerned, I don't really see why it's problematic for me, because I'm saying that, again, wishful thinking, the description of a certain process as being a process of wishful thinking is compatible, as I tried to say, with the resulting propositional structure being true. And similarly, the fact that these conceptual innovations, like the state or the US Constitution, are introduced in the context of proleptically imagining a certain state, which will be a state which will conform with them, it's compatible with my analysis that structures like that actually do become substantial. They do realize themselves. I don't see why anything I say excludes that.
I think
maybe I've not understood the nature of the question.
What I think is, I mean, you say that all human thought has got an element of wishful thinking in it.
Yeah.
And as such, you can everything from the Constitution has got an element of wishful thinking. Newton's theory's got an element of wishful thinking in it initially. But the thing that distinguishes is their success.
Yes, yes.
And I wonder, as a tool,
yes,
how does wishful thinking help us to analyze concepts in a way which provides some kind of utility?
Right, okay. Look, I'm not saying wishful thinking is a universal category that we can use everywhere. That's not my theory. My view is, I'm directed against roles. That's what I'm interested in knocking out. And what I'm saying is, look, there are certain phenomena which I think are genuine phenomena, and if you understand those phenomena, you can see why it's implausible to start in that way. I'm not saying every form of human action is subject to wishful thinking. That, I think, would be not a very useful thought. What I'm saying is that there are lots of phenomena out there that actually are not taken seriously by political philosophers of the standard kind. They if you take them seriously, you're not going to get very far in analyzing them if you just look at them through the structure of the nature of rights. And I try to describe a number of different kinds of cases like that. One is a case of wishful thinking, one is a case of ideology, one is the case of these other things. So you can, of course, use the term wishful thinking in this very general way, but I precisely want to say concepts are like accordions. You can use them in more general ways, you can use them in more specific ways, and I want to sort of allow myself both. I want to say, look, there is an element of wishfulness in all human thought, probably. If you take by wishfulness just the basic idea that if I weren't imaginatively capable of going beyond what I see, I wouldn't be able to know very much, and part of what it is to go beyond what I see is connected with my desire my need to survive in the world. So there's an element of it, but that in itself doesn't discredit my saying that the girl who thought the Archduke was going to marry her was engaged in a particular form of wishful thinking, which was more concrete and more incorrect, more cognitively deficient than the case of a person who introduces the notion of the state. I mean, Hobbes knew very well that there weren't any states out there. He wasn't wishful about that. It wasn't, when Hobbes, if I say, it would be good if we all were now to speak French, and we'll all become French speakers. Now, that's not wishful thinking in any interesting sense, because I know very well that many of you may not be French speakers. That's just proposing a certain change that I think would be a good change. And provided I don't suddenly believe that you're a native French speaker, just because I think it would be a good thing if we all were native French speakers, provided I make that distinction, it seems to me I've satisfied everything that I want to claim. So,
no, just a question, on what you said about Rawls. I mean, I sympathize with this formal reductivist view of having a concept of justice and then let's build a political philosophy out of that. Like I think that's not naive or wishful thinking, but it's precisely very cunning, to ignore these things, right? I mean, in terms of that, Rawls' philosophy would be a successful one insofar that it ignores this realistic dimension of politics. It's not so much about how Rawls, it's sort of naive or of course, it's a formalist, but in terms of constructing this concept of justice and then ignoring the realities of politics. But that's precisely the cunningness, I think, of liberalism, or of liberalism in the Rawlsian way.
yeah.
Right?
Maybe I'm not clear about this. Maybe I should think about that more. You're right. I haven't been very clear about this. I've always found it very suspiciously convenient that the descriptions of political arrangements that people would arrive at under the veil of ignorance turn out to be so close to the way things are organized in the United States. I just found that to be very convenient, so surprisingly convenient. And you're right, perhaps my category of wishful thinking isn't the right category to describe that. That might well be the case. My thought there was, well, he would like to think about himself and his society as having positive virtues, and this is a way of thinking well about himself. And again, there isn't. Again, I'm trying. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm failing pretty. But I mean, I'm trying to be rather non-judgmental about these things. There's nothing wrong with wanting to think well about yourself. I mean, that it might even be unavoidable that we think well about ourselves. I mean, how would we get through life if we didn't think well about ourselves? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that necessarily. And there's nothing wrong with him wanting to describe his own political configuration in a way that that presents its best side. But I think that's different from the project of saying rational agents behind the veil of ignorance would come up to this solution.
Okay, Emily, then maybe a couple more questions.
My question also has to do with realism, which I also liked your use of the term, and in particular the way you, this section 5 where you were sort of narrowing down some of the things that you meant and did not mean. And for the first two, you give very specific disciplinary context for the use of realism in philosophy and then international relations. And in the third, I was wondering if you had something in mind when you were writing about this one, as the realism as opposed to utopianism, at least in terms of a lot of literary political movements. Realism was sort of used as a desire for a wish of betterment of some kind, as opposed to utopianism in the sense that it was used as an analytical tool, the way of looking at the world and trying to avoid that cognitive leap that would lead to a utopianism. Not that wasn't necessarily doable or possible, but as a way to avoid the serious problems of sort of fitting, as you were talking about, naturalized formations on top of a political desire.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the motivation of that is the section in the Communist Manifesto about utopian socialism, and I take it that Marx would have thought that his own position was a realist position in this sense, although it's not a position that, as it were, says that only power is important, and not a position that says that we should only want to do what we can do, because, again, who is we? I mean, the whole point is we shouldn't, whether we is you and I and everyone here, or you and I and everyone who is a wage earner, or you and I and everyone in the world who doesn't own a property of a certain kind, depending on which way you cut that cake, you're going to get very different senses. So, as it were, in the third case, I'm not saying there's realism and utopianism and I'm on one side. What I'm saying is that the distinction, as it were, doesn't do any work there, because the distinction depends on another kind of conceptual analysis, which is one that I think is indeterminate. You can only say it's realist as opposed to utopian if you say, what is the situation, who are we, and what can we do? And we don't always know what that is, and we don't know what that is until we do it, as it were. So if you can't say that, if you can't say who we are and what we can do before you begin the analysis, then what's the point of making that distinction? So it isn't that, as it were, I think that distinction is fine and I want to go on one side of it. It's that I think that distinction doesn't work very much.
I guess my question was mainly because I'm wondering if there's any way that we can rescue realism from that distinction of realist versus utopian. I think that it's very interesting the way that you've used it here, and I'm wondering if there's any possible way that we can look at realism again as an analytical tool of asking that question of who we are in order to get to something projective.
I'm afraid I'd have to think about that. I don't know what to say to that. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, there are a lot of hands up, and I should probably mention right now that we're going to have a workshop tomorrow in Nolte 235 at 5 p.m. to talk about this presentation, but also 2 essays that have been posted on the web. One is called, by Raymond Geuss, one is called Goals, Origins, and Disciplines. Goals, Origins, Disciplines. The other is The Loss of Meaning on the left. So those are available. If you want to know where, just let me know. So who wants to ask a question?
My question is,
where do you go from here with realism? Because in your talk, you went pretty quickly from my position is realism, and here are 3 objections, and I'm wondering, okay, I've got your realism, but then what can you do? Do you say, hey, look, your belief has its origins and desire, yours an interest, yours has this historical genealogy. Then
Where-
what? Would, you know, would...
Yeah,
you know,
okay, good,
this
good.
whole
Oh,
push it
yeah,
back
yeah,
in?
yeah. My view is this, and this, I'm expecting great howls of execration. That's all right, I'll say it. That way of thinking about it seems to me to presuppose a distinction which I don't want to grant. Namely, that way of thinking about it seems to presuppose, well, there's the sort of factual stuff about the world that we know, and then there are these moral requirements, moral demands we have, and they're 2 separate things. And we have to worry about what the moral demands are. There, you know, we know what the world is. That's hard, and we're so confused about what morality is, and maybe it doesn't exist, and maybe. And I don't think that. I think we're swimming in moral conceptions. We have moral conceptions coming out of our ears. We don't have to worry that they're going to run away from us. We don't have to worry that they're not going to be around. We've got plenty of moral views. And what I'm suggesting, and now you might not like this, but I mean, what I'm suggesting is that history and sociology should play a much, much more important role in political philosophy than they've done. Political philosophers have characteristically thought, well, we'll sit around and we'll analyze these concepts, then we'll see how it works. And what I'm saying is if you actually do the historical work of understanding certain, if you actually do the work of trying to understand particular societies, understand how the power structures work, you'll find that that analytical task or descriptive task will change the way you think about what is good and what is bad. It won't be that, as it were, it won't be, as it were, that you'll have an argument. It won't be that because you know this, then you will be, ding, then we should have this value. But as you think about it, as you think about the way influence, power, and these things work in social institutions, so I'm not practicing what I preach because I write these books that are sort of philosophy books. But if I had my life to live over, what I do is, I'd study actually how power works in societies and how it's distributed and how the economy works and how human psychology works, and as much of that as possible, and try to move from that. And I wouldn't think that I'd be, as it were, jumping over an abyss between studying the way the power actually works in a society and then making some kind of normative claim about it. So that's...
Okay, maybe just one more question.
Yeah, so getting this talk, we get the sense of realism. We ought to be kind of realist to some extent. And I was thinking how that worked in terms of number 2, especially, the point about
Roman 2.
Yeah, Roman 2, about how groups get these kind of epistemic environments that they get told how wonderful they are, right? And they're surrounded by reinforcing views, which enhances wishful thinking. And my question is, if say we sort of eliminate this, what is the kind of payoff? Or and does it turn out to be that these isolated groups that are having reinforcing views, that they end up getting into a dialogue and then kind of learning more prudent strategies, or is it more kind of like a thing about dignity, like they're less self-deluded and it's kind of a good in itself to be not deluded, or is it more like a troubleshooting thing?
Okay. Yeah. I want to. The model that I think is the model that is before my eyes is not a model in which, as it were, certain things are wrong and certain things are, this is true, this is false. And it's not a model of, I'm going to get rid of that altogether, I'm going to get rid of you. It's a model of learning to deal with things in a more sophisticated way. So it's a model of becoming more, I would say becoming more enlightened about the world you live in. And that doesn't mean that you sort of think you've necessarily got the truth, or you can always see when you've been engaged in wishful thinking, or you can free your mind completely of wishful thinking. That's not the way I think about it at all. I think that there's I would like to see a process in which that people thinking about their lives and people thinking politically about their communal lives were more reflective about these phenomena and more reflective, more sensitive to them, more reflective about them. And if they were that, that would be already, I think, a step in the right direction.
So would that be more like the dignity side of things, like, as
Dignity.
opposed to like, or is it just like, we don't want to get into kind of practical snafus because we think that, the government of the proletariat is going to distribute resources?
No.
Or is it more just like this, look, we ought to do this because it's just sort of good?
Right.
To be
Well,
enlightened about it?
I think life. Well, again, I take this anti-Kantian line, which people don't like nowadays. I stand with Hegel and Marx and Dewey on this. That you can't say it's better in itself to be more enlightened about things and more sophisticated, or it's good because it will lead to this. It's both, of course, and it's a better life. And if you ask me how you know it's a better life, well, that's a complicated question, and a very complicated question, but I wouldn't want to say one of those or the other. It's both. I don't think there are things that are valuable in themselves and then things that are merely valuable instrumentally. I think that distinction is a distinction that makes perfect sense within certain well-defined contexts, but outside those well-defined contexts, it loses its bite. And so that would be the way I would try to move it, to say that it both will make the political practice better, in that you'll be less likely to make very bad decisions, but also it's a better human way to live, to know what you're doing and know how your thoughts are connected with your desires. It's also just a better way of living. And both of those things are true of it, I would say.
Okay, well, our conversation has gone on now for about 40 minutes. This is about as long as we were required to go on for. So we can start tomorrow and go on for another hour and a half or so. So hope to see you there. Thank you very much.